So welcome to this week's Cooperation Live. You will notice that if you are a frequent Cooperation Live watcher, that I am not Annabelle. She is taking a very well-deserved holiday. So this week you will have me as your host. I'm Georgia O'Brien. You might recognize my name from getting emails from me fairly often. I'm the party's communications officer. And today we are going to be talking about fair trade, and especially in light of the current situation with COVID-19, and also the campaign that we've been running around Nestle removing their fair trade products from KitKats. So for those of you who join us every week, you will almost be sick of hearing this by now, but just a couple of housekeeping things. So this meeting is being recorded so that people who aren't able to join can come back and watch it on our YouTube channel. But that does mean that if people are still in their pajamas or already in their pajamas, then they might want to turn their video off. So if you don't want to appear in any recording, then please just hit the stop video button, and that should mean that your video will stop transmitting. If you would like to ask a question, we're going to be doing a Q&A at the end, but that means until then, we're going to try to keep everybody on mute. And if people could, please just don't unmute yourself in that time, because it means that we'll all be able to hear each other and that you'll be able to hear our wonderful speakers today. The other bit of housekeeping is if you want, when it's a Q&A time and you want to ask a question, there's a couple of different ways you can do that. You can pop a question in our chat box. So my lovely colleague Izzy is currently working behind the scenes, and she'll be able to see any questions that you send in the chat, and we can bring those in. You can also email events@party.coop to submit any questions to our speakers, and also you can raise your virtual hand by pressing the participants button, and that'll let us know that you'd like to ask a question, and that way we can unmute you and you can get your question in. So today we are joined by David Taylor from the Fairtrade Foundation, and also we'll be joined by Stephen Doughty MP, who is the Shadow Africa Minister, a little bit later on. He's just unfortunately running a little bit late. So David is going to kick off by telling us a little bit more about fair trade, what's happening with the current KitKat situation, and will generally be a much more eloquent speaker than I on this. So take it away, David.
Thanks very much. I don't know about that, but I'll certainly try. It's great to see everyone. I am a member of the Co-op Party myself, and I think I was, and I can see Liz there. Good to see you, Liz. I think, on the Co-op Youth NEC, or I don't know if it was called the NEC or anything as grand as that, but was certainly involved as an activist with the Co-operative Party. And I, separate to my day job, am one of the founders and former chairs of the Labour Campaign for International Development, and so we've been working very closely with the Co-op Party for a number of years now, and you've always been such brilliant advocates for international issues, and you've always been such brilliant advocates for fair trade as well. So, I really appreciate all the support that you have all given, and we'll talk about that in a bit more, but particularly the last few weeks on Nestle. I think it's 20,000 of you signed the petition that the Co-op Party ran on Nestle, and Stephen hopefully will join us in a bit, but he's a member of the Fairtrade APPG, the group of MPs in Parliament who are supporting fair trade, a cross-party group, but with a lot of Labour Co-op MPs involved. And we actually had a meeting they had a meeting, we were just observers, with Nestle earlier today to really hold them to account on their disastrous decision to move away from Fairtrade KitKat. But I'll come back to that, but the brief is actually slightly broader, and it's looking at the COVID situation. So I want to first talk a bit about the COVID situation as it's been from a fair trade perspective over the last couple of months, and some of the issues that we're facing, some of the challenges, and some of the ways forward that fair trade has been pursuing, and the ways that we've tried to react to this crisis. So I mean, some of this stuff is stuff that you'll be well aware of, so forgive me if I'm repeating stuff you already know, but the healthcare situation in a lot of the countries that we work in is really not very good. I went to a fair trade tea plantation in Assam a couple of years ago, just before I joined Fairtrade, and we went around the plantation. We met with the workers' committee, and I don't want to claim there aren't problems with some of the plantations in which Fairtrade interacts with. Like, it's a very challenging environment, but I remember them showing me the healthcare facility within the tea plantation, and it looked like it was in a good standard, and was well equipped. And then I went to visit my friend, a friend I've known from my work with Oxfam India in the past, who lives in Assam, and his dad was unfortunately very gravely ill and in a local hospital there. And it was one of the most shocking things I've ever seen. I've not done a lot of development in the field, as it were, so for me to actually be there was to be out in Assam was quite new. I mean, I do a lot of traveling, not to see development projects. But anyway, I'm there visiting my friend, and he says, "Oh, come with me. We just need to go into the hospital to see my dad." And it was just one of the most awful things I've ever seen. I mean, it was, to call it a hospital would be extremely charitable. There was a series of beds with very dirty-looking blankets all over the place, overcrowded, really poor facilities. So the healthcare, even in India, which is supposedly a middle-income country, I mean, we know it's got great poverty, it is really not very good, and that's before you have this global crisis hit. So some of the stats you might have seen from elsewhere, I think Central African Republic has 3 ventilators for its entire 5 million population. Uganda has more government ministers than intensive care beds. We're not dealing with a situation where we have well-functioning healthcare systems, and thankfully the NHS didn't become overwhelmed in the way that we feared it might do, having seen what was going on in Italy. There is a real fear that this crisis may still have a devastating impact in other parts of the world. You only have to look at what's happened in Brazil and increasingly across Latin America to see the risks that are there. So that's the context, and from a fair trade perspective, what we've been trying to do is help our workers deal with some of the fallout of this problem. Now, there's different elements to it. I've talked about the healthcare facility issue just to begin with, but at the early stages of this crisis, a lot of these countries hadn't actually been hit by a health crisis yet, and still thankfully haven't. The big problem was the fall off in demand for some of the products that we certify. So tea workers in India, for example, were actually hit by falling tea prices because Iran is a big market for Indian tea. And Iran, if you'll recall, was one of the first countries to be hit by this crisis. So you saw that immediate tailing off. The problem we've had has been varied across the fair trade system. One of the issues that we've had has been with flower workers in Kenya. So in Kenya, you'll be aware Co-op stock them, Co-op Group stock them. Fair trade roses are a product that we certify. They're flown over from Kenya, and they're primarily flown over on commercial flights. They're flights for sort of tourists. You and I might get this flight to Kenya, and in the hold will be these fair trade roses coming back. And so when the lockdown hit and flights were cancelled, obviously great for the environment, but it did mean that these roses were stuck in Kenya and not able to get to the market in Europe. And also there was an issue where initially, with all the panic buying, supermarkets were quite rightly rationalising their stocks and focusing on getting the essentials to people, toilet roll, for example. But it did mean that items that were deemed luxury goods, like flowers, were not being put out on shelves. So initially, at least, there was a huge drop-off in demand for Kenyan flowers, and that was a big issue. You go over to Latin America, the issue has actually been more related to the lockdown that occurred there. Now, clearly, there are huge benefits to having a lockdown from a public safety point of view. No one would dispute that. But the issue has been is that the timing of that lockdown, and we wouldn't change this, by the way, it's not fair trade saying we don't support the lockdown, we do. But the lockdown came in just when the coffee farmers in Latin America were due to harvest their crop for the second crop for the season. So clearly, if those coffee beans are not being picked, they go to waste, and that is a loss of income for those farmers. So there's just been this various different elements to that, and that's before you get to this issue around healthcare and the impact it could have on health systems if it hits in a big way. So what have we been trying to do to mitigate that? Well, we immediately loosened the conditions around the fair trade system to make it easier for farmers and workers to be able to access the funds they needed to get extra supplies in, be it food or be it equipment such as PPE, masks, and so on. So we changed the rules around the fair trade premium to expand it so that there was more flexibility to enable farmers and plantations to be able to make those kind of purchases. There's also been a sort of nice few examples of where communities have adapted to try and, fair trade cooperatives rather, have adapted to try and support the local community. So in Colombia, banana producers contributed by changing some of the premium fund that they had to pay for a project with the local university to set up an emergency COVID testing centre. Sports producers in Pakistan have switched from making fair trade football to making masks to distribute in the local community. And in Peru, the coffee cooperatives there were providing food supplies to elderly people and those who wouldn't otherwise be able to access them. So there has been some good to be done by fair trade cooperatives, and we've obviously been working hard with retailers to try and mitigate some of the impact. We've also been fundraising to try and get money from donors to set up an emergency relief fund and a resilience fund so that we can build that better to make these communities more resilient to future shock. And I think the figure's 3.1 million euros we've managed to get in funding so far for that fund to help these communities through this. Now, and we're in the process of distributing that. We're trying to focus on the communities that are most impacted and direct the money there. It's a very fast-paced environment, and clearly it's changing all the time. I've been working on the Assam tea issue and trying to see what we needed to do there, and that has changed from initially we were very worried about the lockdown that the Indian government had put in place and whether we might see people running out of food and rations. Thankfully, that hasn't been the case, and the lockdowns are actually being gradually lifted in Assam. People are back to work, and now the focus becomes on making sure that if they are going back to work, they're able to work safely and with adequate PPE. So it just gives you an example of how the situation can change quite rapidly, and we've tried our hardest across the system to try and work through these issues. We've also been contributing to the advocacy that others have been doing on this. So there was around some of the G20 actions, we've been joining those other organisations who've been calling for the G20 to act. And we had a letter that went to G20 leaders from all of the CEOs in the fair trade system, calling on G20 leaders to get behind the calls for debt relief, for extra aid for these countries, for extra aid for the WHO, and with our own ask around funding for furlough schemes, so that when lockdowns do come into place, there is adequate support, as there has been in the UK, for people who suddenly find themselves unable to work. So we're obviously a small fish in a big pond when it comes to global advocacy. Trying to influence the G20, I mean, you know, it's obviously hard to try and influence G20 leaders' position, but we've been keen that we're part of something bigger than the fair trade system and contributing to the NGO action on that. And you know, there has been some good news there. There was debt relief, you may have seen, agreed for from the World Bank, IMF, and some G20 countries to developing countries. It's not enough, but it's a decent start. So it's good that at least has been done. Overall, there's no doubt in my opinion that the response by G20 leaders has been risible. I'm sure everyone here will agree the same. It just, compared to what we were able to achieve, we Labour and the Co-op Party were able to achieve before 2010, when Gordon Brown hosted the 2009 G20 summit. the coordination has just not been there, unfortunately. But so that remains obviously a huge worry and concern, and how individual countries are implementing their own lockdowns is a big concern as well. And we're working in country to try and ensure that farmers and workers are supported by their governments as much as possible. At the moment, overall, the picture is probably one of luck in terms of the health system. It hasn't reached some of these rural communities yet. They don't have the facilities, so let's hope that they don't. Possibly the fact that they are that much more remote has slowed it down a bit. The fact that that some of these places have poor quality roads, it's probably, most of the time we'd be saying that the roads need to improve and the infrastructure needs to improve. Actually, probably on this particular incident, it's helped the fact that some are speculating that the reason why it hasn't quite had a devastating impact in Africa as we might have expected so far is because of the lack of infrastructure, but that's no reason to be, there's very limited things to be positive about there. But in terms of the fair trade system, we're trying to do what we can to adapt and support the farmers and workers we work with to get through this. On Nestle, I'm extremely grateful to 20,000 of you who have signed that petition. It's really helpful. We're still trying to do what we can to put pressure on Nestle to reverse their decision. We had a meeting with, the Fairtrade APPG and MPs had a meeting with Nestle earlier today. It was a cross-party meeting, and it was really fantastic to see so many MPs supporting fair trade in that way. They really did hold Nestle's feet to the fire. Whether they go away from that Nestle and decide to reverse their decision, I don't know, is the honest truth. But what is clear is that there is value in putting pressure on Nestle so that to reverse their decision, at least in showing to other companies that there is still a huge amount of support for fair trade amongst the British public. So on that side, I mean, we can talk about this before the end of the meeting, but we definitely would encourage you to keep raising awareness of this issue on social media in particular, like if asking questions of Nestle and asking them publicly, why is it you're making this decision? What are the reasons for it? Like, how are you going to support these farmers? Will they be worse off? That's still really important. As far as we know, as far as we understand it, that they're moving over to the Rainforest Alliance model. I'm not here to talk ill of Rainforest Alliance, but we're very proud of fair trade's impact. We do have currently the highest premium when it comes to fair trade cocoa, and so Nestle have to answer the question: how are you going to ensure that farmers are not worse off by this decision? Because if fair trade has got the best premium, and we do, how are these farmers going to be compensated for the loss that they will have from this switch? And so we'll have to see. The other thing I should mention as well is that it's been postponed because of COVID, but we are looking to do more on climate change in terms of our campaigning and our advocacy, and we have just launched a new sort of pledge and campaign on that. So I'll share that with you in the chat. Perhaps it'd be great to get people to sign up to that campaign and join us on that journey. The UN climate talks are going to be in the UK next November instead of this November, but we're still looking to do stuff on that. And yeah, I think that's probably a good overview of the issues. I'm very happy to have a discussion with you on the different issues.
And that's great, thank you so much. And I think that's really helpful context there will have been lots of people who, obviously we have many committed fair trade supporters within our members, but also we will have some people maybe on this call who don't know that much about fair trade or about the specific context of what's happening with fair trade now, because like you said, there's a lot of issues happening around with how fair trade farmers might be affected by COVID, but also just the fact that, like you've said, there are this is not the first company who have chosen to back away from fair trade, and often they're heading towards self-certification schemes where they're marking their own homework, and it's really important that we keep flying the flag for fair trade, and that, like you said, having that highest premium really makes a difference for farmers. And so it's really important that we back fair trade, and that as cooperators, where we talk loudly and proudly about the great work that fair trade does, especially for farmers on cooperatives all around the world. And like you said, one of the best ways to do that is obviously speaking out on social media, because we want other brands who might be considering doing something similar to save costs or whatever their reasoning might be, to look at this kind of outward effect that it might have on their brand and say, no, we don't want that to happen to us. So it's really, really important that we kind of make ourselves heard, and that we keep pushing Nestle and keep making them see that there's a lot of people out there who are really unhappy with this decision. So I've seen so many people on social media who have been acting the Nestle and KitKat accounts on Twitter and using the hashtag #MyBreak hashtag to ask Nestle not to take a break from fair trade. And if there's anyone who's on this call who hasn't done that yet, it would be a great action, and even if you've already done it do it again. Keep this issue alive for as long as you can. If you don't use Twitter, going on their Facebook page and leaving comments and asking these questions is really important, because we've kind of got to keep this issue alive for as long as we can, and hopefully that'll see them change their mind. And you mentioned the meeting that happened today. That was kind of in the context of our parliamentarians sent a letter to the Nestle CEO last week, and he sent a response that we still feel doesn't answer all of our questions, because I think one of the key lines that they keep coming back to, and it might be something that you can talk more about, David, is this idea that they're trying to mitigate any effects that the farmers might feel. And even though they continue to claim that that this is the new certification method and the new kind of actions going forward aren't going to have an adverse effect on farmers, there's still a lot of questions that we have, and I think we need to keep holding the feet to the fire on that. I don't know if that's something that you could expand on more, David, around kind of like what Nestle have come back and said, and what our kind of general response as a movement is.
Yeah, I mean, it is where to start to an extent. I mean, the main thrust of their argument is that they are, and you know, we do certify other Nestle products, so I think it's very clear that as a fair trade representative, it's not. We want to keep the dialogue respectful, and we want to continue our relationship with them. But the questions that they still need to answer is, you know, how are they ensuring that farmers are not going to be worse off, because that's what they're acknowledging there'll be an impact on farmers. They've talked about a few things they're going to do to mitigate that, but in terms of what that actually means for the money in the farmer's pocket, I think there's still question marks around that. So publicly they've talked about paying $180 a ton to cocoa farmers. Well, we pay, under the fair trade system, you pay $240 a ton, so that's already $60 down. So what's going to compensate for that? And they've talked about doing a program to help improve the productivity of those farmers. We would 100% support that, and indeed we're in the process of developing our own living income pilots with some other commercial partners. The trouble with these programs is that they take time, and they are pilots, so you can't automatically expect results from them, and you can't automatically expect scale. So they do need to answer what happens at the end of that pilot if they aren't able to get the productivity gains that they're expecting. How are they going to ensure that farmers aren't left worse off? And you might see in some of what they say that I'll choose my words carefully, because I'm not here to slag Nestle off, but the thing that's worth bearing in mind is there is this overall context which Fairtrade has contributed to, of the governments in these countries in West Africa, Ghana and Ivory Coast, changing the regulations around cocoa to increase the minimum price that anyone, whether they're Fairtrade, Rainforest, Nestle or whoever, anyone has to pay, which is a really fantastic thing. So over the last few years, fair trade minimum price has kicked in because the global cocoa price has plummeted. It primarily plummeted because there was too much supply, and a few other, and a bad harvest and a few other different reasons. But cocoa prices a couple of years ago really fell through, went down, and the fair trade minimum price provided a safety net, which was really important. What the government of the Ivory Coast and Ghana are going to do going forward is try and set their own minimum price and introduce something called a living income differential. So it's essentially a bonus payment, like the fair trade premium, of another $400. And in some of the messaging that Nestle have come out, they said, oh, well, actually our commitment to farmers is going to increase over the next few years. But it's a little bit of it's them sort of conflating what everyone is going to have to pay anyway, because everyone from October, whether you are fair trade, rainforest, or anything else, you're going to have to pay this minimum price, and you're going to have to pay this $400. What we're saying is that on top of that, we're also going to give $240 a ton. And what Nestle is saying is that on top of that, they're going to give $180 a ton. But that's still a $6 difference, right? So you might find in some of their interactions back to you that they're saying that, you know, we're going to be paying this living income differential. Well, they're not alone in that. Like, it's a government mandated thing. And the fair trade minimum price is still relevant because, yes, there is going to be this government minimum price for the next year, possibly the next year after that, and so on. But we don't know what's going to happen with the market price. If the market price were to plummet again, then it makes it harder for these two governments to keep their own minimum price. Because if you suddenly find that cocoa from other parts of the world without this minimum price is cheaper, then they're going to be under pressure to drop that. And if they were to do that, our farmers would be protected by the fair trade minimum price, if that makes sense. So yes, just because it's likely that the government minimum price in these countries will protect farmers, it's not a guarantee in the way that the fair trade minimum price is a guarantee, if that makes sense. But I appreciate this is reasonably technical, so sorry. I'm very happy to clarify any of this stuff, but yeah, there's still question marks basically about what they're committing to farmers and how long is that commitment.
No, it's actually really useful to know that technical detail, because we've actually seen that Nestle have been really proactive on social media and going back when our supporters have been asking them questions. But it's always really helpful if when you're reaching out to Nestle or KitKat on Twitter, if you tag the party in and we can see their responses and have a little look, because like you're saying, that it might be that there's a little bit of obfuscation happening, and it's, like you said as well, it's also really helpful if everyone keeps a good civil tone and asks really good, helpful questions. There is a great frequently asked questions on the Fairtrade Foundation's website, which I would really recommend. And if anyone has any questions about how they can most helpfully contribute to the kind of the social media pressure going forward, then they are welcome to get in touch with the party as well. My colleague has dropped it in the chat, but just in case anyone hasn't seen, unfortunately, Stephen Doughty has been pulled away for parliamentary business, so he's not going to be able to join us, which is why you've had a little bit more of me speaking instead. I don't do a very good Stephen Doughty impression, but I've tried my best. But I just wanted to add, just as a little bit of parliamentary context, that he probably would have added another issue that that we're working on, that is kind of an issue alongside of this, is obviously the decision to merge the Department for International Development into the Foreign Office, and that is something that the Co-operative Party are also doing a lot of work on trying to underline the importance of international development in what we do going forward. And we believe that that will have an adverse effect on fair trade, because it means that some of the greatest champions in the international development movement for fair trade may no longer have a stronger voice. So we're doing a lot of campaigning on that online as well. And so I'd really recommend, if anyone hasn't seen the stuff that we're doing around that, to check that out as well, because it's another way that we can help support fair trade and other ones around. I am going to open up the floor for questions. So we've actually had a couple come through in the chat already. So I'm going to read out a couple, and then if people would like to ask questions directly, if you could raise your virtual hand, and I will unmute you as well. So I will read one out first. So Vanessa wanted to know about, do you know anything of the situation where cocoa beans that are sourced from South America, or does South America no longer produce cocoa to the world market, and are their beans usually fair trade?
Yeah, great question. The good news about Latin American cocoa is it actually does tend to be more the sort of specialist chocolates, so the dark chocolate single origin beans, and it does actually command a better market price. So the fair trade farmers are protected by the same system that a fair trade farmer in Ghana or CBI would be, but they tend to command a better price. It tends to be more the sort of organic single origin, Ecuadorian kind of chocolate. I know the Co-op group do a great range of those chocolates. So yes, definitely, there's still plenty of chocolate produced in Latin America, but it tends to be those kind of smaller single origin things. The reason why West Africa is being talked about so much is because that's what is called, no, I won't use the term because it's pointless, but if you think about the sort of everyday chocolate bar and everyday sort of milk chocolate, things like Maltesers, various other things like the Co-op own brand chocolate, that your sort of standard chocolate, which I love very much, but that is tends to be from these beans that are produced in West Africa. A lot of the Cadbury's stuff is from West Africa, and the stuff that's used as the deemed higher quality dark chocolate is the stuff that comes from Latin America. But I don't say that in any sort of snobby way, because I'm personally not a fan of dark chocolate at all, and my favourite fair trade chocolate is Maltesers. So, but yeah, but in terms of volumes, most of it comes from Ghana and CDI for that reason, and Latin America and some of the Indonesia tend to produce some of the more specialist chocolate.
Well, luckily, speak of the devil, Stephen Doughty has just managed to come into the call. So I'm gonna unmute you now, Stephen. Can you hear me? Can you?
Yeah, I can hear you. Let me just pop my video on.
Hello.
Hi, apologies. I'm sorry for the appendage here. I'm just in the little room behind the House of Commons chamber. So, but great to see you all. So.
No, thank you so much for managing to get in. I know it's been a busy day today.
Yeah, absolutely. No, great to join you all, and great to see David speaking just before. So I've been with David this afternoon. He's probably been relaying our meeting with Nestle. So really, just want to thank as well all the Co-op party members and supporters who've been campaigning on this, not just on the issue of fair trade, but also on the abolition of DFID. And obviously we were in DFID questions today with Preet, one of our fellow Co-op MPs, and she was very strong with Anne-Marie Trevelyan on the government's complete failures on that. And obviously these two things are linked because DFID over many decades has been a champion of fair trade and of cooperatives, and certainly in the last Labour government that I was proud to be part of, working with good Co-op colleagues like Gareth Thomas as Minister of State for International Development. We were able to make sure that more support went to co-ops in the Global South, and went into supporting fair trade, and there was some real huge progress. So obviously what we've seen in terms of DFID, but has been hugely regressive. But what we're seeing from Nestle at the moment specifically is also hugely regressive. And I was kind of hoping that they would have some sort of degree of explanation for what they've been doing today. But I'm sure David's relayed that that was not the case. And in fact, actually, I was left more concerned actually as a result of the meeting with them, because not only the lack of consultation with the very people that they claim to be working with, who they told us had regretted the decision they'd made, and yet they're still going ahead with it, but them essentially abusing their position as a major buyer and monopsonist, really, in a way, saying to them, well, you can take it or leave it. They've also been, typical tactics from a major corporate, trying to, sort of spin their way out of this and claim that in some way Rainforest Alliance is a kind of a higher grade standard than fair trade. sort of putting a lot of things out there in the mist to try and deflect from a fundamental issue, which is that they're going to be paying less of a premium, which is going to mean less for the farmers and the producers. And also, again, as I said, that kind of complete lack of consultation and engagement with the producers that they're working with, and which of course very much goes against the principles of cooperation and the cooperatives that they're supposedly working with. So it's a hugely difficult situation at the moment, but I'm very confident actually the way that the campaign has gained ground over the last few weeks with all of your support, but also many, thankfully, also across the political spectrum who've raised serious concerns on this. We're in a situation where I think that they're feeling the heat, and as we've seen on these things before, that can force changes. So really just encourage everybody to keep the campaigning up and to make clear, for our consumer power as well, that we're not going to see these things happen and not going to take them lightly, because they're retrograde and they're regressive. Those are the sort of two big challenges that we've faced this week. Obviously got a lot of other issues in the portfolio. I've been meeting today with experts from across West Africa, actually, incidentally, about trade and challenges of COVID, and also with a range of people across the Global South on a whole series of issues, from trade to health to education. But of course, cooperative movement plays a crucial role in many developing countries, and certainly there's a very, very strong commitment at the heart of our team, not least because of the number of us who are Co-op MPs, that this is a future part of any Labour and Co-op agenda going forward. And we wouldn't do what the Tories have done on DFID, we wouldn't do what they're doing on Fairtrade, and we'd set out a very, very different vision for the future.
That's great. So you entered just as we were about to start our Q&A. So I've asked people to raise their virtual hands or drop questions in the chat. So I'm just going to unmute Andrew Jenkins. I'm just going to unmute you so you can ask your question. Andrew, you should be able to speak now.
Yes, please. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, I can hear you great.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm working with farmers in Bangladesh. So very interested to hear this, and I'm really disappointed with Nestle and this, and very glad to join the petition and so on. I completely agree with the situation of medical services. I have one colleague whose aunt has died and has 5 close relatives who have tested positive, and they're not going to hospitals in Bangladesh because there's nothing there for them. There's no point. They're just trying to survive at home. So it is very scary. What I'd like to ask about really is the point David raised about resilience, which I think is really important, because this is not going to be the last shock that farmers are going to face. I think it would be good maybe if we could use possibilities to encourage cooperatives to move towards more resilience in terms, for example, of producing more of their own food for their own consumption. Farmers I work with in Bangladesh were fortunate. They do export within the country, but they also produce a lot of the food they consume. So they've weathered this situation fairly well. There are also areas, I think, where people are short of finance, and so they're unable to store food, buy it when it's cheap, and use it when it's more expensive. So that has to do with financial instruments. And then I was quite involved with microfinance, and I was working with BRAC, which is a large development organization in Bangladesh, about including insurance against shocks, natural shocks, financial shocks, health shocks, into the microfinance as a form of insurance. And I know this in a way can make things more complicated, but I wonder whether there are ways in which fair trade movement and the co-op movement can actually use this opportunity to improve resilience through these type of measures, because I think, unfortunately, we will see a lot of it, and people who are very dependent on something like exporting flowers are actually very vulnerable, and also commodity producers like cocoa and coffee producers are very vulnerable to multinationals. If we can reduce the vulnerability a bit, I think it would make quite a big difference. Thank you.
If either of you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, sure. No, thank you. Yeah, it's a really good point. And I mean, we try and approach it in different ways, and it's easier in a farmer setting than it is in a plantation setting, because in a farmer setting you can design programs, and indeed we have been doing so, to try and get farmers to diversify their income so that they're not just dependent on that one commodity they export. So for example, with cocoa farmers, we've been working on helping them grow cassava and various other crops that they can sell locally, or they can use this to feed themselves if they need to in these circumstances in which we're talking about here. What we're wanting to do is to use this, use is the wrong word, with this crisis, we're going to the companies we work with to say, now more than ever, we need you to help support these kind of programs, to go above and beyond the commitment that you are making as by having our mark on your product, to do these kind of projects on a bigger scale. So we have been talking to some of these companies about these different programs before COVID hit. Nestle talked about doing their own living pilot. We've actually had one in the pipeline for about over a year now, with another commercial partner who obviously can't share, unfortunately, who they are yet. But when it comes, it's going to be really quite an exciting project, and it's exactly looking at this kind of resilience and making them more sustainable. I think the harder one is on the plantation setting, because, and this is really where, I mean, fair trade is partly about the long-term solutions. It's also about trying to make an immediate difference now. And that's ultimately why we decided to certify some of these products in the first place. I've always seen fair traders working with trade justice and the wider development movement to look at those sort of slightly long-term transformations. With the plantations, and what we try to do is try and make an immediate difference now, but it does come with real, it is a bit of a dilemma in some cases, because as you say, these communities are very vulnerable to external shocks, and they're often quite deep-rooted problems. Like the problems with tea in India, for example, go back to the British Empire, and these plantations didn't exist before Britain started to grow tea there, and the structures that in the Indian government law, it comes from the Plantation Labour Act, which was enacted in the 1950s. So there's really deep-rooted problems that fair trade is trying to address and shift the tea sector in a good direction. But it's very hard to do it, frankly. You know, we certify about 10 plantations in northeast India. There are about 800 in total. So how we make those communities more resilient is a lot harder. Like if the flower industry in Kenya, for example, doesn't survive COVID, then we can't just walk away. There isn't an alternative for these flower growers. These are plantations in the middle of nowhere often, and unless there's internal migration from them to elsewhere in Kenya, then we can't. What we don't want to see, and I know you're obviously not suggesting this, it's not directed at you in any way, but one of the things that we've been thinking about is we don't want to repeat what happened in this country in the 80s with those coal mines shutting. You know, if these places aren't sustainable for economic reasons or for climate reasons, you know, we're looking at this from a climate change perspective as well, and we're actually doing some analysis of the climate footprint of fair trade roses at the moment, because we do have to ask ourselves, is that really the right thing to do given where the world is going? But the answer to that can't be just to pull the plug on these communities and leave them high and dry. So yeah, so in short, I think it's with the farmers, it's a lot clearer for me what to do to support these communities. With the plantations, I think there's a lot harder. But what we're trying to do is apply to DFID, apply to the German Development Corporation, apply to different governments to try and get some money for our COVID response and resilience fund, and appeal to the companies as well, of course, so that we can increase the sort of program interventions that might help and push people in the right direction.
So I know we're running over a little bit, so I'm going to try just fit in just a couple more quick questions. I think that we've got one in the chat that'll probably be for you, Stephen, asking about that's from Anne, who's asking how many MPs belong to the all-party parliamentary group on fair trade, and how active are they? What kind of work do you do, and how best they can support you?
I'm not sure how many there are, but there are a substantial number. It's definitely one of the most subscribed groups, certainly probably 30, 40 individuals who are active at any one time. There was certainly a substantial number on the call today, and I think that, you know, kind of the level of concern from constituents and others raising, it's obviously dominated by Labour and Co-op colleagues, but there are colleagues from other parties there as well, and I think that's a powerful signal. It has been a very active group in the past, certainly in terms of education around colleagues in Parliament, working in our own communities as well, bringing fair trade producers over to speak, so that we hear firsthand the experiences and the positive benefits that come from being part of fair trade, but also many of us involved actively as well in our own sort of fair trade movements in our own towns and cities, and you know, in the case of Wales, in the whole country, but also I would say particularly when there's been opportunities to campaign, you know, we saw what happened with Sainsbury's with tea, Nestle now following different but similar vein, and I think we've always got to be on guard about this and regressive steps, because I've got a firm view that fair trade has been one of the, you know, sort of biggest, not only, you know, sort of impactful development measures, but one of the ones that's really directly connected people with the lived experience of people producing the food that they eat and being able to improve their circumstances in a very positive way. And I think it's been one of the greatest development educators actually over the last 3 decades, far more than some of the, you know, the campaigns I was involved in with different humanitarian organisations. I think it's something that's just really connected a whole bunch of people across the whole country.
That's great. Paul Birch, I know you've been waiting for a while, so I'm going to unmute you and hopefully you'll be able to ask your question.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, thanks for that, Stephen. I've been to BRAC in Dhaka, by the way, David. So, sorry, Andrew. So I know Bangladesh is up against a lot of problems. And actually, perhaps it's less known that with fair trade cotton, a lot of the fair trade cotton, for instance, that's sold by Sainsbury's under their 2 brand, is actually sown in Bangladesh. And it's sown in Bangladesh because they can avoid the duty on exports from Bangladesh, which would otherwise be payable from India. The Sainsbury's are actually at the root of a lot of problems, just as they were with tea. And part of the problem that we are facing is not just Rainforest Alliance, it's also direct trade. And I don't think that the co-op group or even the independent societies are as up for supporting us as you might think that they are. I run, when I'm, you know, council thing, obviously we're all councillors, but I run Revolver, which is a fair trade coffee cooperative, and we've got 350 members. We have 2 or 3 members in Honduras and in Costa Rica. And yeah, we're coming up against direct trade, you know, constantly, even with societies like Mid Counties and with Central England. We're coming up against this as an alternative option. None of these people, of course, it's a bit like the Rainforest Alliance. There are no Rainforest Alliance church groups, city groups, in the same way that there are fair trade city groups. I'm secretary of Fair Trade Birmingham. But that's in its own right, I've got to say, is a big problem, because the city groups, I don't think they have the support that they did. We certainly don't have the membership that we once had for meetings. And also, I've got to say, with Fair Trade Foundation, one of the ways I think it's slipping is, I can't remember the last time I was called to a producers meeting. And I've been at producers meetings in the past with just about everyone. I think this is one of the reasons why we're seeing people like Divine, you know, in cocoa, you know, stepping back, and obviously it's been taken over by Weinrich. And we're looking at fair trade cocoa. Just to give you a clue on that, by the way, just to make one chocolate bar, we have to order 3 tons of cocoa from Weinrich in Germany just to put 1 chocolate bar on the shelf. So it is difficult. I know that Sophie at Divine, I think she did a great job, to be honest with you. Can I just say, I know I'm supposed to be asking questions, but On the Maltese, on the Roundtree Nestle thing, right? Once they've gone, right? And I think this negotiation that you do with them has to be more than just look, please sympathetically at developing world farmers. I think you have to give them a break. I think you're gonna, if you can bring them back, or stop them from leaving the room, I would be looking at saying, look, let's do a deal, right? Based on just 2 years. We know that you've gone through a very difficult time, and you're about to go through an even more difficult time with Brexit. That's just going to be awful. We'll give you a break for 2 years on the license, just to keep them involved, because losing Cadbury was very difficult. Now we lost Sainsbury's, or we lost part of Sainsbury's own label, at least. There's difficulties on tea, there's difficulties on cocoa. Round the corner, there's going to be difficulties on coffee, right? So let's try and keep these people in. Sorry, it's not really a question, really. In the end, it's a rant. Forgive me. But look, I'm on side, and I want us to be successful. Can I just say one more thing for the councillors engaged here? For all of those of you who've got a city group and who their city have made a pledge to the Fairtrade Foundation, here's a little test. Do they really serve Fairtrade coffee and tea, which is what they're meant to do? I'm going to tell you that I absolutely know the answer. My own city, which is Wolverhampton here, they don't. They never have. In 10 years, they've never done it. But I know at Fairtrade Foundation, nobody wants to kick anybody out. We want everyone in, right? If you're going to keep people's feet to the fire, right, we can't just hum the song. We've got to sing it as well. That's it. I wanted to say.
No, it's a really useful perspective, and I know that we have a lot of councillors on this call, and they'll be able to be putting kind of those actions into place in the communities around the country. One of the strongest places that we are as a cooperative party is in local government, so it would be great if we had more councillors taking action to support Fairtrade in all different ways. I'm going to answer a last question and then maybe ask Stephen to make some closing remarks, but it's a question that I'm actually going to answer myself. Liz Peltz has popped up and asked me to repeat what the hashtag is that KitKat use on their campaign on social media. It's hashtag #MyBreak. So it's a great one because it means that the people who monitor those social media accounts have to make reports about how their kind of hashtags and how the kind of communications that they get fed to higher ups. And so it's really important that we kind of keep putting pressure on that side of things, so that that voice is still being heard. So yeah, that is hashtag #MyBreak, and my colleague has also put our petition in the chat for anyone who hasn't signed it yet. But Stephen, I don't know if you want to make some closing remarks about Fairtrade and about the situation that we're now in, and that would be great. I think you're still on mute, and you need help unmuting.
Yes, I do. Sorry, it wouldn't let me do it. So no, look, I think just touching a little bit on that last comment there. I mean, I think sadly the situation that we're facing on this particular case is indicative of a wider set of struggles that we have to remake and re-engage around the arguments about equity and development and around fair trade and development sport in general. I think that there is a very different agenda being driven by this government. There's a real danger with Brexit, with the agenda that they have around trade, a very sort of selfish, nationalistic agenda that they're pushing forward. And we have to be the ones to challenge that again. And the best way that we can do that is from the grassroots, whether that's as consumers with individual corporations who are slipping away, or whether it's in remaking the case within cooperative and labour parties, within councils, within the plan for a future labour and cooperative government. We've got to be out there making that case, because there's going to be huge challenges in the years to come, and choices that have to be made, whether that's on trade deals, whether that's on aid funding, all of these issues. So please campaign and please be out there.
Can I just say one thing as well? I know we have to wrap up, but yeah, look, I mean, Paul made some really fantastic points there, and rest assured that we're obviously trying incredibly hard to ensure that we keep as many of these big companies on board as we can. And it's not always obvious. For example, on the Cadbury side, we may have lost a bit of visibility of the mark on the packet, but in terms of the volume of cocoa sold and the money going into the pocket of farmers, that has actually increased over the last few years. So it's definitely not all doom and gloom. The Nestle thing is unfortunate, and I really, really value your support in pushing that. But last year, 36 million euros were generated in Fairtrade premium. That's a real difference for farmers and workers across the world. So, yeah, as Stephen rightly points out, it's an incredibly challenging environment at the moment across the board on these issues, but Fairtrade's still making a difference, and we still really value the support that you give as Co-op Party members, so please do keep giving it. It may seem like the light is the end of the tunnel is very long way away, but it is still really important, so please do keep sticking with Fairtrade.
And I can see that you've just popped into the box a link where people can sign up to hear more from the Fairtrade Foundation, which I'm sure will be really helpful for all the people on this call. And so I'm just gonna wrap up just as a last couple of actions that people can take. Signing up to the Fairtrade's mailing list is a great one. If you haven't already signed the petition on Fairtrade or on the work that we're doing around DFID, please do. You can find that on our social media channels. And we touched a little bit on climate, and I believe, and if I get this wrong, my colleague Izzy will have something to say, but I believe we're having, in 2 weeks, we'll be having one of our cooperation lives on the cooperative Green New Deal and what we can be doing as cooperators on the climate emergency. So if you'd like to hear more about that, then you can go to the front page of our website, go to Cooperation Live, and double check I'm right when I say that it's in 2 weeks, because I believe it is. But yeah, it has been great to have you all on the call, and thank you all for joining us. I know we went a bit long today, so thanks for sticking with us. And thank you to our speakers as well. Okay. See you next time, people.